In this world, a woman without money is not a person. She is a problem passed from one set of hands to the next, wrapped in whatever language makes the transaction sound like kindness, until someone agrees to keep her and calls it charity. Eleanor Vane was that problem. 22 years old, her father 3 years dead, his debts very much alive, her aunt's patience worn down to a surface as thin and cold as the soles of Eleanor's one good pair of shoes. The family had discussed her future the way one has discussed a leak in a roof, not whether something must be done, but who would bear the inconvenience of doing it. The Duke of Levenwood needed an heir, a signed paper, and a wife who would not trouble him. Eleanor's family needed £23,000 of debt to disappear. Everyone present at the negotiation agreed this was a reasonable exchange. No one asked Eleanor what she needed, because in a room of that kind, in a year like 1814, the question would not have made sense. When the hired carriage came to collect her on a gray November morning, Eleanor did not cry. She did not look back at her aunt's house. She opened her writing case on her knees before the wheels had even turned, and she began without permission, without instruction, without anyone having suggested it was her place to do so, to take notes. The Duke thought a woman like that would be easy to forget. He thought she would wait and manage and cause him no particular trouble. He thought a great many things about Eleanor Vane, right up until the morning her carriage came around the front of Wickbourne Hall and did not stop. The road into Derbyshire turned bad 12 miles before Wickbourne, and Eleanor used the time to finish her second page of notes. The carriage was not a comfortable one. Levenwood had sent his second best, which told her something, and the jolting made her handwriting uneven, but she had learned long ago to press the nib lightly and compensate. Outside, the November fields ran gray and flat between hedgerows gone colorless with cold. A thin sky pressed down on all of it. Eleanor noted the condition of the fencing along the road, the state of the gate on the first tenant's farm they passed, the fact that the bridge over the tributary stream had a section of railing missing on the eastern side. She was not sure yet what she was collecting. She collected it anyway. Wickbourne Hall appeared at the end of a gravel drive lined with elms that had not been properly trimmed in several years. The house itself was large and old and built in the serious northern style, which meant it looked like it had been designed to outlast the people inside it. Eleanor studied the gateposts as the carriage passed between them, good stone, but the mortar was going, and the iron hinges on the left gate had rusted through at the joint. The gate hung slightly open at an angle that suggested it had not closed properly in some time. She wrote it down. She was still writing when the carriage stopped and the footman opened the door and stood waiting with the careful blankness of a man who had not been told how to receive this particular kind of bride. Eleanor closed her writing case. She stepped down without assistance, not from pride, but because the footman's hand was occupied with the door and she was already moving. 2 more footmen were unloading the luggage from the second carriage, and she watched long enough to see her writing case lifted, hesitated over, and then moved toward the servants' entrance. "That one," she said, not sharply, not apologetically, in the tone of someone correcting a direction on a map. The footman redirected it. She tucked it under her arm and followed the housekeeper inside. The housekeeper's name was Peg Dunnet, a narrow woman with an efficient walk and the expression of someone perpetually calculating square footage. She showed Eleanor to her room's 3rd floor of the east wing, which was the correct wing for a guest and the wrong wing for a duchess without commentary, and recited the household schedule in the flat cadence of someone who had given the speech before and expected it to require adjustment. Eleanor listened. She memorized the times, the names, the order of precedence among the staff. She thanked Peg Dunnet precisely and asked one question: where were the household accounts kept? The housekeeper paused, as if the question were slightly irregular, then told her they were in the estate office and managed by Mr. Beale. She did not meet the Duke of Levenwood until dinner, and he was not as she had been led to believe by her aunt's correspondence, a man who looked like his title. He was tall and lean in the way that comes from a great deal of being outdoors rather than a great deal of care, and he had a scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear, pale, well-healed, old enough to have stopped mattering to him. He looked at her across the dinner table with eyes the color of the sky she had watched from the carriage, and he said, "Miss Vane," and she said, "Your Grace," and that was the entirety of it. Soup arrived. The rest of dinner passed in the kind of silence that two people produce when they have agreed, without speaking, not to perform for each other's benefit. He said one thing of substance before she retired. She had mentioned, not complained, simply noted, the way one notes weather, that the east wing was rather cold. He set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she could not read, and then he said, "I will have fires set." She said that would not be necessary. He said it would be done regardless. She said thank you, in the same tone she had used with the footman about the writing case, which was not grateful so much as accurate. He did not speak again. Aunt Dorothea Crail arrived 6 days later in a hired post-chaise, with 3 trunks, 2 hat-boxes, and the brisk cheerfulness of a woman who has arranged to be useful and intends to make the arrangement visible. She kissed Eleanor's cheek, and one of examines with rapid, comprehensive eyes, and that evening at dinner she performed a version of Eleanor for Levenwood's benefit that Eleanor did not recognize, gracious, pleasingly domestic, quietly grateful, and Levenwood watched it all with the same unreadable expression he used for everything. Eleanor ate her soup. She was beginning to understand that unreadable did not mean absent. It was Dorothea who arranged for Eleanor to attend the Wickbourne Assembly Rooms 3 weeks after her arrival. The assembly was a modest affair by London standards. The market town of Ashford-on-Hurst was not Bath, and its assembly room smelled of tallow candles and damp wool coats and something underneath both that Eleanor categorized privately as old money going stale. Local families attended. Some were prosperous. None were particularly grand. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was 3 seasons behind the current fashion but well maintained, and Dorothea had lent her a pair of long gloves that were slightly too large and kept sliding down at the left wrist. Eleanor pushed them up every quarter hour and did not think about it. The chair was an ordinary assembly chair, gilt-painted wood, padded seat, the kind made in sets of 30 for exactly this purpose. Eleanor had been seated in it for perhaps 20 minutes, beside a potted fern and a card table that was not in use when Lady Fenwick arrived. Lady Fenwick was a baronet's wife, loud with a cheerful confidence, and she required a chair beside her sister, and who was nearest, simply took the empty chair, the chair beside Eleanor, without looking at Eleanor, because she was the kind of woman one did not look at before moving a chair that was beside her. The chair was gone. Eleanor was left beside a space that announced to anyone observing that she had been weighed and found insufficient to require a seat next to. She did not move. She set her hands in her lap, crossed her wrists in the way she had learned, did not pull at the loose gloves, and watched the dancing. Her face was level. She was thinking about the tenant rent accounts, and whether the figure she had glimpsed over Beale's shoulder on her way through the estate office were consistent with what Pegdunnet had told her about the last harvest. She did not see Levenwood arrive. She only became aware of him when a stillness moved across the nearest cluster of guests, the way stillness moves when someone significant has entered a room. She did not turn her head. She was aware, from the corner of her vision, of a tall figure crossing the floor at a pace that was not hurrying and was nonetheless very direct. He stopped beside her, not beside the gap, beside her. He stood with his hands loosely at his back and looked at the dancing with the same expression he used for everything, and no footman on earth was going to remove what was next to him. Eleanor looked up at him. She said in a quiet voice that would not carry more than 2 feet in the noise of the room, You are standing on my foot. He looked down. He stepped back exactly 1 pace. He did not apologize. He did not move away. The space he occupied remained occupied, and Eleanor looked back at the dancing, and her wrists stayed crossed in her lap, and something in her chest that had been very carefully arranged shifted, slightly, without her permission. He left without saying anything when the first set ended. She did not watch him go. She stayed until Dorothea collected her at 9:30, and on the carriage ride back to Wickbourne Hall, she opened her writing case, and in the road making her handwriting uneven, she wrote down the name of the footman who had taken the chair, the name of Lady Fenwick, the date, and the time. She wrote it down because she was not sure yet what it meant, but she had learned not to let things that seemed important go unrecorded. At the bottom of the page, after some consideration, she wrote, "He stepped back exactly 1 pace. No more, no less, as if the distance had been calculated." Then she closed the case and held it on her knees, and did not think about it anymore for the rest of the ride. The marriage was formalized on a Tuesday in the parish church of Ashford-on-Hurst, with Dorothea and the estate solicitor, Mr. Hartley, as witnesses, and a thin sleet coming down outside that made the church windows weep gray lines down the stone. The ceremony was brief. Levenwood said, the words in the voice he used for everything level, without inflection, as if reading aloud from a document he had already reviewed. Eleanor said hers with equal precision. When the vicar pronounced them married, Levenwood looked at her with the unreadable expression, and she looked back, and neither of them performed anything for the other. In the carriage back to Wickbourne Hall, he told her the terms. He spoke without preamble, the way a man speaks when he has prepared remarks and considers preamble a form of softness. She had the West Wing, the household accounts, and a quarterly allowance of £60 to be reviewed annually. He had the estate office, his private study, and his mornings from 6 until noon, during which he was not to be interrupted except in the event of structural emergency. She was welcome at dinner. She was not required at dinner. She was not expected to attend his social obligations in London, though she was welcome to do so if she chose. He paused after this, as if waiting for the flinch, the negotiation, the appeal, the wifely adjustment of expectations that he had perhaps encountered before. Eleanor was writing in her case. "That is acceptable," she said, without looking up. "I would add one condition." He said nothing, which she understood as permission to continue. "I would like access to the full household accounts, not the summary versions Mr. Beale provides to the housekeeper. The originals, with receipts." He was quiet for a moment. "That is an unusual request," she said. "I am an unusual accountant." Another pause. "Agreed," he said. He looked out the window. Eleanor returned to her notes. She had the full accounts on her desk by Thursday. The household moved around her in the manner of a household that has established its rhythms over years and regards a new duchess the way it regards new furniture, as something to be worked around until it either proves useful or is rearranged. Peg Dunnett ran the staff with the efficiency of someone who has not been supervised in some time and is not certain she welcomes it. The cook, a Mrs. Halloway by prior marriage, presented Eleanor with menus for the week and watched her read them with an expression of studied neutrality. Eleanor made no changes to the menus. She did, however, spend an hour or two with the supply receipts, comparing the coal deliveries against the fuel logs, and when she found that the chandler's current contract had not been renegotiated in 4 years and was running 14% above market rate, she wrote to the chandler herself. The new contract arrived by the following Tuesday. Peg Dunnett said nothing about it. Eleanor did not expect her to. The cook's double billing took slightly longer to find. The pattern was not crude. It was spread across 3 categories of supplies: poultry and beeswax and lamp oil, and it had been running for at least 2 years before Eleanor arrived, which meant it had begun under someone else's tenure of the accounts. Eleanor totaled the discrepancy, noted it without annotation, and left the figure on Peg Dunnett's desk with a short note that said the supply records for the previous 2 years required review and that she would be happy to assist. Peg Dunnett appeared in the accounts room the following morning with the expression of a woman who has received an offer of help that is also unmistakably a choice. She sat down. They reviewed the records together. The cook was given notice the following week, quietly, for unrelated reasons that were not unrelated. Levenwood noticed. Eleanor was certain of it. The way she was certain of things she had observed, without being told the slight pause when he passed the grounds room and the door was open, the way he had stopped dismissing the household summary at dinner and begun reading it. He said nothing. She did not expect him to. But the quality of his silence changed, somewhere in the second month of the cold marriage, from the silence of a man who has decided not to look at something to the silence of a man who has decided to look carefully from a distance. The proximity accumulated in small administrated increments. He left a copy of a county land survey on the table in the West Wing corridor, the table she used as a sorting surface for his state correspondence, and she was not certain whether he had left it deliberately or whether it had simply migrated there in the way papers migrate in a house with no clear organizing principle. She moved it to his study door with a note. The Caldwell boundary markers on page 47 appear inconsistent with the current enclosure map. I have the enclosure map if it would be useful. He did not respond. 2 days later, the enclosure map appeared on the corridor table, returned with the Caldwell section annotated in a handwriting that was compressed and precise and had been educated at some expense. She brought the corrected survey to dinner. He looked at it. She said, "The discrepancy is about 3 acres in their favor." He said, "I know." She said, "Have you spoken with the Caldwells?" He said, "Not recently." She said, "It may be worth doing before spring." He looked at her across the soup tureen with the look she was beginning to learn was not unreadable, it was reading. "Yes," he said, "it may be." He drank his coffee at 7 in the morning. She knew this, because the kitchen produced it at 7, and the smell of it reached the accounts room where she was already working. She did not want coffee at 7, but she had noticed that the kitchen fire went down between 7 and 9 while the cook's replacement settled in, and that the pot on the hob stayed warm longer than it was being used. She began leaving a note on the tray, 1 cup, please, for the accounts room. When the pot is ready, and the coffee appeared on the corner of her desk without discussion. One morning she arrived to find a second pot already there, larger, with 2 cups arranged on the tray as if by habit. No one had asked her. No one mentioned it. She poured 1 cup, left the other, and worked through the morning. The second cup was gone when she returned from lunch. It was in the 3rd month that she asked Mr. Hartley about the promissory notes. Hartley was a thin, careful man from Derby who wore the same gray coat in every season and communicated primarily through the arrangement of papers on his desk. He had come to Wickbourne Hall to review the quarterly estate accounts, and Eleanor had been given access to the meeting room, another quiet negotiation conducted through note and counter-note on the grounds that she was managing the household expenditure, and it was reasonable for the accounts to align. Hartley had accepted this with the expression of a man who finds it reasonable in principle and mildly inconvenient in practice. She waited until the business portion was concluded, until Levenwood had left the room, and Hartley was gathering his papers in the methodical way that meant he was preparing to leave. She said, in the casual tone of someone asking about the weather, "Mr. Hartley, I have a small question about note instruments purely for my own understanding. If a promissory note changes hands, is the new holder's name registered anywhere formally, or does the instrument simply pass and only the holder knows?" Hartley looked at her over his papers. He had the expression of a man being asked a professional question by someone who is not a professional, and he was deciding how much to simplify. "The latter," he said. "The note itself is the instrument." The holder presents it for payment when due. There is no registry. So a note could be held by almost anyone, Eleanor said, and the issuer would not necessarily know. In theory, Hartley said, with the air of a man closing a door on a room he does not wish to stand in. Good day, Your Grace. She thanked him and did not press. She had what she needed. She made a note small, in the margin of that day's accounts page, between two figures that meant nothing to anyone else, and returned to her work. That night, Levenwood passed the accounts room on his way to his study, and the door was open, and he stopped. She did not look up. He said, "You have a fire." She said, "I asked Peg to set one." He said, "The east wing fires run to 8. She said, "I told her 9. A pause. He said, without any particular warmth, and with something that was not quite its opposite, "The west wing can run to 10 if you require it." She looked up then. He was looking at her writing case, open on the desk, the way a person looks at something they have seen before in a different context and are trying to place. She said 9 is sufficient. He looked back at her. He nodded once and walked on. The tenant accounts were kept in a ledger that had not been rebound since 1807, and the pages toward the back had begun to separate from their spine in a way that made Mr. Beale handle it with the practiced carelessness of a man who knows a thing is fragile and prefers not to draw attention to that fact. Eleanor had been watching the ledger for 6 weeks before she touched it. She watched who handled it, how often, whether Beale locked it or simply set it in the lower left drawer of the estate office desk, which he locked with a key he kept on his person, but left in the estate office door whenever he was working inside. She was not planning anything, exactly. She was collecting. The thing that broke it open was Will Peg, the 12-year-old son of a tenant farmer in the Northfield holding, who developed a winter fever in January and whose father came to the hall on a morning to ask if the estate had any stores of willow bark or camphor, because the apothecary in Ashford-on-Hurst was 4 miles in the ice, and he could not leave the boy. Eleanor was in the accounts room. Peg Dunt would have sent the man away with a polite refusal and 3 shillings. Eleanor was already at the still room before the man had finished explaining, and she came back with willow bark, dried elderflower, a jar of honey, and a set of instructions she wrote out in a plain hand and read aloud to him twice to make certain they were clear. He thanked her with a directness that people of his kind use when they mean it entirely and have no social machinery to soften it. She sent him home in the estate gig, rather than have him walk back in the cold. Peg Dunnett watched all of this from the corridor with the expression of someone revising a calculation. Levenwood heard about it at dinner from Peg Dunnett, who reported household events with the reliability of a woman who believes her employer should know what is happening in his own house. He looked at Eleanor across the table. She was eating her soup. He said, "The Pegs are good tenants," she said. "The boy is quite sick. I will go tomorrow to check on him." He said, "The roads are bad." She said, "I know. I will take the gig." He did not say anything else. But in the morning there was a footman assigned to the gig, and a heated brick for the floorboards, and a second basket of supplies that had not come from her still-room order, but from the estate storeroom, which meant he had spoken to Peg Dunnett before 6 in the morning. Eleanor looked at the basket. She made no comment. She drove out to the Peg farm and spent an hour with the boy, who was young enough to look at a duchess as simply a woman who knew about fevers. And she stayed until she was certain the instructions were being followed correctly, and on the way back she stopped at 2 other tenant holdings to look at the drainage issue she had noted 3 weeks prior, because she was there and it seemed efficient. It was on the way through the Northfield, yes, she saw the second ledger page. Not the ledger itself, a receipt, folded and tucked into a dry stone wall junction at the edge of the Peg holding, which had come loose in the wind and was caught against the mortar. It was a tenant rent receipt, Peg holding, dated the previous October, for an amount that was 14 shillings higher than the figure recorded in the estate ledger under the same date and name. Eleanor stopped the gig. She picked it up. She read it twice. She put it in her writing case. The estate office was empty that afternoon. Beale had gone to Derby on business, and the key was in the door. Eleanor was not a woman who deceived herself about what she was doing. She went in. She took the ledger from the lower left drawer. She sat at Beale's desk, and she worked through the tenant accounts for the previous 4 years, cross-referencing against the household receipt summaries she had already memorized, against the quarterly income figures Hartley had presented, against the harvest reports in the county record that Levenwood had let her borrow from his library shelf. She worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she was done, she had a figure. The estate had been shorted over 4 years by an amount that was not negligible. Not catastrophic. Beale was careful, had kept it below the threshold that would trigger a formal audit, but consistent, systematic, and entirely explicable by a man who had calculated that no one would look closely enough to find it. She replaced the ledger. She returned the key to the door. She went to the accounts room, and she wrote out her findings on two sheets of paper, in the format she had learned from watching Hartley: fact, date, source, figure, conclusion, and she left the sheets on the corridor table outside Levenwood's study with a note that said only, "When you have a moment. It is not urgent, but it is important. E." He came to her that evening. She was in the sitting room with a book she was not reading, and he knocked, which he had not done before, which registered and came in with the 2 sheets in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who has read something that has reorganized several other things he thought he knew. He stood in the center of the room. He said, "How long?" She said, "At least 4 years from what I can trace. Possibly longer, but the earlier records are incomplete." He said, "You are certain?" It was not a question. She said, "I am certain." He looked at the sheets again, then at her, with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the reading look. Something past it, something that had lost its administrative quality entirely. He says, He stopped. He started again. "I have been operating on these numbers for 3 years. She said, "I know." He said, "I thought the estate was worse than it was." She said, "The estate is not as broken as you thought. It has been quietly robbed." A long silence. He looked at the sheets. He looked at her writing case on the side table, the initials pressed into the corner. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You will want to speak with Hartley before you let Beale go. The dismissal should be documented." He said, "Yes." Another silence. He said, "Was there anything else?" She said, "Not tonight." Beale was gone by the following Friday, and the dismissal was indeed documented, and Hartley reviewed the accounts with the expression of a man who has missed something significant and is furious with himself about it. Levenwood said nothing at dinner the night Beale left. He ate his soup, but he refilled Eleanor's wineglass without being asked, which he had not done before, and she noted it and did not note it aloud. Mr. George Wenlock began calling in February 26, personable, son of a neighboring estate, with the cheerful social confidence of a man who has never been made to feel inconvenient. He came ostensibly to discuss hunting arrangements with Levenwood, who was rarely available when he arrived, and so Wenlock took tea with Eleanor in the front drawing room and talked with the easy fluency of someone who finds himself interesting. Eleanor listened with the focused attention she gave to most things, because Wenlock knew the local land disputes the way a man knows the countryside he has grown up riding through, and he had opinions about the Caldwell boundary question that were useful, and she was in the process of extracting information about a drainage easement on the eastern edge of the Wickbourne estate when the drawing-room door opened and Levenwood came in. He looked at Wenlock. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Wenlock again. He said, "Wenlock." Wenlock rose, affable and unreduced, and said he had just come about the hunting dates. Levenwood said, "My secretary has the calendar. He will be available Thursday." Wenlock looked between them with the instincts of a man who has read a room and found himself surplus to it. He made his farewells. He was at the front door in 4 minutes. Eleanor heard the carriage go. She was standing when Levenwood came back to the drawing-room doorway. She said, in a tone that was precise and entirely level, "I was in the middle of a conversation about the eastern drainage easement." He said, "Wenlock does not know anything about drainage easements." She said, "He knows which landholders will contest a renegotiation and which will not, and I needed that information." A pause. He looked at her with an expression she had not yet named, something between the reading look and something she did not have a word for yet. He said, "I was not aware the easement was under a review." She said, "It is not yet. I am gathering information before deciding whether to raise it." Another pause, longer. He said, "I will have Hartley pull the original easement documents." She said, "I have already requested them." He looked at her for 3 more seconds in that unnamed way, and then he nodded once and left. She sat back down. She picked up her cup of tea, which had gone cold. She drank it anyway and thought about drainage easements and did not think about the expression on his face, which she had almost, just almost, been able to name. It was Dorothea who came for a fortnight in March, with her 3 trunks and her 2 hat boxes and her comprehensive, rapid eyes. She arrived full of warmth for Levenwood, and efficiency for Eleanor, hugging her niece with the practiced affection of a woman who performs family and performing it well, and she spent the fortnight watching. She watched the way Eleanor moved through the house. She watched Levenwood at dinner. She watched how the staff spoke to Eleanor now, which was differently than it had in November, and she watched the way Levenwood's eyes tracked to the accounts room door when he passed it. On the 12th day of the fortnight, she took Eleanor to her sitting room and shut the door and said in the gentle, direct tone of a woman delivering unwelcome arithmetic, "A wife with nothing to her name has no ground to stand on, Eleanor. No court, no solicitor, no paper will ever act in your favor, only his. You understand that?" Eleanor looked at her gloves, the good pair, the ones that fit her properly now because she had replaced the borrowed ones in January. She said quietly, "Yes, that is the principle exactly." Dorothea looked at her with the expression of a woman who has landed a point. She had landed something. She was simply wrong about what. The Wickbourne Assembly Rooms held their winter charity concert on the last Friday of March, and Dorothea arranged for them to attend. It was the same room, same tallow smell, same damp wool, same gilt chairs. Eleanor sat beside a column near the musician's end of the room and listened to a competent, if uninspired, program of Handel and Haydn, and watched the audience the way she watched account pages for the discrepancies, the figures that did not add up. She was aware that Levenwood had arrived and taken a position near the far wall, which was where he stood at events of this kind, close enough to discharge social obligations and far enough to avoid most of the conversation. She was also aware that Dorothea had positioned herself among a cluster of local matrons near the door, the optimal location for the movement of information. The concert ended. The tea was brought out, and Dorothea, in a voice calibrated to carry to exactly the right number of ears without appearing to project, said to Lady Fenwick the same, chair, different occasion, "One does hope the arrangement is settling. The Duke is, of course, so very particular. His first marriage was such a love match, you know. One wonders if a practical arrangement can ever truly satisfy a man of his sensibility." Lady Fenwick's response was murmured and indistinct, but her expression was not. And the expression traveled, the way expressions travel in small rooms with good acoustics and people who are paying attention to everything. Eleanor heard it. She was 3 feet away, with her back to Dorothea, examining a watercolor print on the wall with more interest than it warranted. She heard it, and she noted it, and she took her cup of tea, and she stood very still because she was deciding something, and she needed to be still while she decided it. The thing she decided, she did not write in her case. Some things did not need to be written. Ornament was Hartley's idea, which meant it was Levenwood's idea delivered through a professional intermediary, which was how Levenwood handled every decision that cost him something to make directly. Eleanor understood this about him by April. She understood a great many things about him by April that she had not understood in November. And the understanding sat in her chest in a way that was not comfortable and that she had not yet decided what to do with. The thing that moved him to it was not Dorothea's performance at the concert, though that had been the occasion. The thing that moved him was dinner the following Tuesday, when Eleanor had said, in the level, accurate voice she used for all things, I would like to engage a solicitor of my own. Not for any matter that concerns the estate, a personal matter regarding my mother's trust instrument. He had looked at her across the table with the reading look. He said, you have a maternal trust. She said, a small one. My father's debts were his own. The trust was settled before their marriage and was not subject to his creditors. He said, I was not informed of this. She said, no. He looked at his plate. He looked back at her. He said, you may engage whomever you choose. She thanked him and finished her dinner, and he watched her do it with an expression that had, over the previous 3 months, migrated from unreadable to something she was close to reading, and the closeness of it was what frightened him. She knew that too. She was not unobservant, and neither was he, and what they had built in the accounts room and the corridor and the dinner table and the cold shared air of Wickbourne Hall was something neither of them had contracted for, and he was a man who trusted contracts. So Hartley arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of April, with his gray coat and his careful papers, and the specific gravity of a man carrying instructions he finds professionally reasonable and personally somewhat uncomfortable. Levenwood was in his study. Eleanor was sent for. The study smelled of wood smoke, leather bindings, and the faint mineral smell of the river that ran along the north edge of the grounds, a smell that came through the stone walls on damp days, and had become, over 4 months, the smell Eleanor associated with Levenwood himself. She noticed it and set it aside. She was carrying her writing case. She set it on the edge of the desk when she sat down, as she always did, with the initials facing up. Hartley began. He was thorough and not unkind. The grounds were irreconcilable incompatibility, a legal instrument that required no specific evidence and cast no formal aspersion. The terms were as follows. Eleanor's quarterly allowance would continue for a period of 3 years, at the current rate, unconditionally. Her personal effects and the contents of the West Wing were hers to remove. Her reputation would be protected by a mutually agreed upon account of the separation, a private matter, handled quietly, dissolved by mutual consent. She would be free to return to her aunt's household, or to establish her own, as she chose. The settlement was, in the language Hartley used, generous. In the language Eleanor used internally, it was administration. It was Levenwood's constructing a ledger entry for a situation he did not know how to categorize any other way. She let Hartley finish. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight, and her face at the level angle she used when she was thinking through a problem and did not want her thinking to be visible. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Hartley." She reached for her writing case. She opened it. She removed from the interior pocket a folded portfolio thick paper, tied with a thin cord, used for document storage. She set it on the desk in front of Hartley. She said, "Before we proceed, I think you should review these." Hartley looked at the portfolio. He looked at Eleanor. He untied the cord with the hands of a man who has reviewed a great many documents and knows when a document is going to change something. He opened it. He read the first page. His face did the thing that careful men's faces do. When careful men encounter something they did not know was in the room, it went very still, and then it went careful in a different way, the way that means recalculating. 12 promissory notes. Levenwood's name on the issuing side. The debt instruments were legitimate, drawn through a Derby bank on standard terms, transferred to secondary holders through entirely routine transactions. the kind that happened every week in commercial and landed circles without attracting particular notice. The holder's name on each one was a Bath solicitor named Ancroft and Associates. The beneficial interest named behind Ancroft and Associates was Eleanor Vane Ancroft, Duchess of Levenwood, acting in her personal capacity under the terms of a separately established account funded by quarterly household management allowances. 40% of Levenwood's outstanding debt obligations, purchased at market rate over 8 months, held by his wife and entirely legal. Hartley set the portfolio down. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in a voice from which he had removed everything except its professional dimension, "Your Grace." He was not speaking to Levenwood. Levenwood had not moved. He was standing behind his desk with his hands at his back, which was the posture he used when he was listening to something he had not anticipated and was deciding how to receive it. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the portfolio. Eleanor did not look at him. She said to Hartley, "I have not purchased these notes as a hostile instrument. I am not threatening foreclosure. I am simply noting that if the annulment proceeds, the question of the debt obligations will require resolution before either party is free to act independently, since I am now, in the technical sense, the Duke's largest single creditor, and a creditor's interests must be addressed before a dissolution instrument can be considered complete." She paused. "I imagine that complicates the timeline somewhat," Hartley said, with the precision of a man who respects good legal thinking regardless of its source. "It complicates it considerably." He began to gather his papers. He was not gathering them to continue the meeting. He was gathering them because the meeting had become a different meeting, and that different meeting required preparation he had not brought with him. He was at the door when Levenwood said, "Hartley." Hartley stopped. Levenwood said, "Thursday. Come Thursday." Hartley said, "Yes, Your Grace," and left. The door closed. The study held its wood smoke and its leather and its cold river smell. Eleanor was still seated. The portfolio was still on the desk. She had not looked at Levenwood since before Hartley read the first page, and she did not look at him now. She looked at the portfolio, and she thought about what she had done, which was not a thing she was uncertain about, but was a thing that had a weight now that it was in the room rather than in the writing case. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire shifted and settled and threw a different angle of light across the desk. Then he said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, not the dinner voice, not the administrative voice, not the estate voice, something underneath all of those, something with a grain of the wood rather than the surface. "How long have you known how to do this?" It was not a question about skill. She understood that. She said, "My father's solicitor took me on as a copying clerk when I was 17. I copied correspondence for 3 years. I knew what a promissory note transfer looked like before I knew what a ballroom looked like." A pause. He said, "Your aunt did not mention this." She said, "No." Another pause. He said, "You arrived here knowing the rules of this." She said, "I arrived here knowing I had no other rules to play by." The fire settled again. She looked at the portfolio. She said, "I did not purchase them to harm you." He said, "I know." She said, "I purchased them because your aunt," she stopped, corrected, "because Dorothea told me that a woman with nothing to her name has no ground to stand on. She was right, so I found ground." The silence that followed was the longest one. Outside, the river ran along the north edge of the grounds, and the sound of it came through the stone, and the study smelled of wood smoke and leather and cold water, and Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and waited to find out what kind of man he was when there was no contract between them to stand on. He said, "You looked at the gateposts when you arrived." She turned her head. He was looking at the writing case. The initials pressed into the corner, the case she had carried in from the carriage on the first day, while a footman tried to send it with the servant's luggage. "You were already taking notes." She said, "Yes." He said, "Before the marriage was even." He stopped. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was not the reading look, and was not the unnamed look from the drawing room, and was not anything she had catalogued. It was the look of a man who has understood, retroactively, that he has been observed as carefully as he has been observing, and that the balance is not what he thought it was. He said, "What else is in the writing case?" He said, "Everything." He looked at it, he looked at her. He said, with a precision that was the closest she had yet heard him come to something that was not administrative, "I did not know." She said, "I know you did not." A pause. "That is why I did not tell you." He moved to the window. He stood with his back to her and looked out at the river and the north fields. And his hands were at his back again, but differently, not the listening posture. Something held more tightly. He said, "Dorothea." She said, "Shaw filed a claim against my mother's trust 3 months ago, through her own solicitor in Derby. The claim is based on a misreading of the trust instrument, or a deliberate misreading. I have not yet determined which that would require my father's estate to be re-administered with the maternal trust included as an asset, which it was not, which it cannot be." He said, "She told you this." She said, "Her solicitor's clerk told a Bath solicitor's clerk, and the Bath solicitor told me." Paper moves. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the new expression, the one she did not have a name for yet, and she thought she was close to naming it and pulled back from the edge of doing so, because naming it would require something from her she was not yet certain she was prepared to give. He said, "And the trust instrument?" She said, "I have the parish register, the one that documents the trust settlement date and the settlement terms." She said this to the portfolio and not to him. "The claim has no legal path once the register is produced, but I need to produce it in the right circumstance, or Dorothea simply refiles through a different instrument, and we spend another year on it." He said, "What is the right circumstance?" She said, "Public, with witnesses. When she has already committed to the claim formally enough that retreat costs her something." He said nothing. She said, "I have been waiting for her to move." He said, "How long have you been waiting?" She said, "Since January." He turned back to the window. She heard him exhale, not quite a breath, not quite something else. He said, "You have been managing this entire—" He stopped. He said, "While the Caldwell easement and Beale and the Chandler and Will Pegg." He stopped again. She said, "I am not good at waiting without also being useful. It is a habit I am aware of." A long silence. He said to the window, in the grain of the wood voice, "I was going to let you go." She said, "I know." He said, "I was going to frame it as consideration." She said, "I know." He said, "I had convinced myself it was a kind thing." She said, "You convinced yourself of several things about this arrangement that were not entirely accurate." He turned from the window. He looked at her directly, and she looked back, and what was between them now was not a contract and was not a cold marriage, and was not the administrative silence of two people managing not to feel anything in the same house. It was something that had no ledger entry, and no quarterly review, and no dissolution instrument available to it. And he was a man who did not know how to hold things that could not be administered. And she was a woman who had told herself for 22 years that she was only permitted to exist in spaces where she was solving something, and the thing she was not solving yet was this. He said, "The portfolio stays on the desk." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thursday, when Hartley comes." She said, "Yes." He said, "Dorothea is coming to the Assembly Rooms spring dinner. She has already accepted," Peg Dunnett told me. Eleanor said, "I know." He said, "You want to move then?" She said, "I want to give her the opportunity to commit publicly." Then yes. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. He said, "All right." He said it in the voice of a man who has, without quite being able to account for the moment it happened, changed sides. The portfolio remained on the desk. Hartley's annulment papers remained in Hartley's briefcase. Outside, the river ran cold and present along the north edge of everything, and the fire in the study settled down to coals. And Eleanor sat in the chair with her writing case on the edge of the desk, and the initials facing up. And Levenwood stood at the window looking at his fields, which were not as broken as he had thought they were, and at least one thing remained unresolved. Dorothea's claim was filed and active, and would press harder now that the annulment had failed, because Dorothea was a woman who understood arithmetic and would understand immediately that she needed to move before Eleanor's position at Wickbourne became any more secure than it already quietly was. The first attempt was Levenwood's, and it failed in the way that his attempts at feeling tended to fail through the application of resources where presence was required. He sent the revised allowance offer through Hartley on the Thursday. It was doubled, unconditionally, with a note in Levenwood's compressed handwriting at the bottom that said, "The previous terms were drawn without full information. These reflect a corrected assessment." It was, Eleanor understood, the most personal document he knew how to write. She held it for a long moment, long enough to feel the weight of the effort it had cost him to write corrected assessment rather than "I was wrong," and then she folded it, replaced it in the envelope, and returned it to Hartley's hands with a short note that said, "The allowance is not the question, Mr. Hartley. Please tell him I said so." Hartley delivered this response with the expression of a man who has been a solicitor for 23 years and has never before been asked to carry a message that was simultaneously a legal communication and something else entirely. He reported Eleanor's words to Levenwood verbatim, because he was a precise man, and he watched Levenwood receive them with the particular stillness of a person encountering a problem they cannot administer their way out of. And then Hartley picked up his gray coat and left without being dismissed, because some rooms need to be left. Levenwood stood at his study window for a considerable time after that. He was not looking at the river. He was looking at something internal and finding the landscape unfamiliar. He was a man who had loved once a love that had arrived complete and present, and then had left, taking with it his certainty that feeling things was a sustainable enterprise, and he had spent 6 years since then organizing his existence into a series of transactions that could be reviewed, adjusted, and if necessary dissolved, because dissolved was better than lost. He had brought Eleanor into this system, and she had quietly, methodically, and without once asking his permission, refused to be organized by it. She had organized it around herself instead. And the thing he had sent Hartley to retrieve the revised offer, the corrected assessment, had come back. And what it said when it came back was that she did not want the allowance corrected. She wanted something he did not have a document for. He was not a man who knew how to produce things he did not have documents for. He stood at the window and he worked on the problem the only way he knew, which was slowly and with his hands clasped behind his back and with the river running cold along the north edge of everything. The Wickbourne Assembly Room's spring dinner was held on the second Friday of May, and the assembled Darber gentry came in their good clothes and their good jewelry and their interest in each other's arrangements, and the room smelled of beeswax and hothouse flowers, and the particular anxiety of people who dress for occasions, because occasions are where the social order is confirmed or revised. Dorothea arrived with Lady Fenwick, which told Eleanor something about the coalition Dorothea had been building since March. Levenwood arrived with Eleanor, and said nothing on the way in the carriage, and she said nothing. Speaking in the silence was this working kind, two people thinking through the same problem from different positions. He stood with the local landholders near the east wall, which was where he always stood, and Eleanor took a chair near the center of the room, which she chose deliberately because it was visible from every angle, and she wanted to be findable. She had the parish register in her writing case. She had carried the writing case herself from the carriage, as she always did, and set it at her feet, and sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Dorothea work the room. Dorothea was good at this. Eleanor had always known she was good at this. The same talent for social arithmetic that made her dangerous also made her genuine pleasant company. And she moved through the room, gathering warmth and returning it with the ease of a woman who has spent 40 years practicing. She spoke to Hartley for 4 minutes in the corner near the fireplace. She spoke to the Fenwick baronet for 3 minutes near the door. She was building something, circuit by circuit, and Eleanor watched it and recognized the structure. She was establishing witnesses. She was not going to make her move quietly. She was going to make it here in this room, in front of these people, because she had calculated correctly that a public claim is harder to contest than a private one, and that Eleanor, as a woman, would find public exposure costly in a way that paper alone was not. It was a good strategy. It had one flaw. Dorothea crossed the room at 8:30, when the dinner tables were being cleared and the guests were in the loose, sociable movement of an evening settling into itself. And she stopped in front of Eleanor with the warm, concerned expression of a woman raising a difficult subject out of love. She said, in a voice pitched to carry to Lady Fenwick and the Hartley wife, and 2 other women within 7 feet, "My dear, I have been meaning to speak with you. I have engaged a solicitor in Derby regarding your mother's estate, the Vane Trust settlement. There are some questions about the instrument that my solicitor feels require clarification. And as your nearest relation," she paused, with the precise timing of a woman who has rehearsed this, "I felt it was my responsibility to ensure the matter was properly examined. I know you understand." She held Eleanor's eyes with the expression that said, "I have done this publicly, and you cannot contest it here without making a scene." Eleanor looked at her for 3 seconds. She reached down and opened her writing case. She removed a document, not the portfolio, not the promissory notes, a different document, smaller, older, its edges worn with the softness of something handled many times. She said in a voice pitched to the same 7 feet, "Thank you, Aunt Dorothea. I had anticipated your concern." She held out the document. "This is a certified copy of the parish register entry for the Vane Trust settlement, dated the 3rd of April, 1802. The trust was established under a separate instrument, settled before my parents' marriage, held in my mother's name alone, and explicitly excluded from Vane's subsequent marital estate by the terms of the settlement deed. The exclusion is recorded here on this page, in the hand of the parish vicar, witnessed by 2 churchwardens, and countersigned by the Derby Consistory Court. The instrument is not subject to my father's estate administration, and a claim filed against my father's estate cannot reach it." She paused. "Your solicitor will confirm this when he reads the register. I imagine he should have read it before filing." Dorothea's face did not collapse. She was too practiced for that, but something in it went very still. The stillness of a calculation that has hit a wall it did not know was there. She said in a lower voice from which the warmth had departed, "Where did you get that?" Eleanor said, "From the parish in Bath, where it has always been." She said it simply, without triumph, because triumph was not the point, and she had never been doing this for the feeling of it. Lady Fenwick had taken a step closer. Hartley's wife had taken 2. Dorothea looked at the register. She looked at Eleanor. She said, "Eleanor." Eleanor said, "The claim is without legal foundation. I trust you will instruct your solicitor accordingly." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "I am glad you are well, Aunt Dorothea." Dorothea left the assembly rooms 40 minutes before the evening ended. She did not speak to Eleanor again before she went. She did not speak to Hartley either, which meant she had already understood what Hartley would tell her if she asked. The claim had no path. The register was conclusive. She had committed publicly to a position that had just been publicly dismantled, using a document she had not known existed, produced by a woman she had spent 4 months calculating was without resources. She was not ruined. Dorothea was too careful to be ruined by a single evening, but she was reduced. which, for a woman who had built her position on the management of other people's reductions, was its own kind of consequence. Levenwood had witnessed it from the east wall. Eleanor did not look at him during, but she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, precisely, as one is aware of a fixed point. When it was done, she closed her writing case and set her hands in her lap and looked at the center of the room, and after a moment she heard, from somewhere behind her right shoulder, the specific quality of silence that meant he was standing near her. He did not speak immediately. Then he said, in the grain of the wood voice, quiet enough for only her, the register, "You have had it since January," she said, "since the 21st of January, when the Bath solicitor confirmed the Derby filing." A pause. He said, "You waited 4 months." She said, "I told you, I needed her to commit publicly." Another pause. He said, with a precision that was not quite admiration and was not quite something else, but occupied the territory between them, "You knew she would come here." She said, "She is a woman who understands the value of witnesses. So am I." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Will you come home?" She turned her head then and looked at him, and the expression on his face was the one she had been close to naming for 3 months, and she named it now in her own interior without writing it down, because some things do not need to be recorded. She said yes. She picked up her writing case. He offered his arm, and she took it, which she had not done before, and they went out into the May evening, where the air smelled of new grass and cold stone and something that was neither. The accounts room at Wickbourne Hall was lit when they returned, because Eleanor had left the lamp burning on her way out, a habit she had developed in her father's solicitor's office and had never broken. Levenwood came to the doorway. He stopped. He went away. He came back 11 minutes later. She had been listening, tracking his movements through the house, the way she tracked most things by sound and interval, and he was carrying a single sheet of paper, which he set on the desk in front of her without preamble. It was a marriage settlement, 1 page, drawn in his hand, which was compressed and precise, and had been educated at some expense, and which she recognized from the annotated survey and the enclosure map and the morning coffee note that had appeared on the tray without explanation. The terms were equal. Her name appeared first. The household accounts were confirmed as her domain without qualification. A separate allowance, not quarterly, not reviewable, was established from the estate income as a standing instrument in her name. The promissory notes were acknowledged by name and number as legitimate personal holdings to be maintained at her discretion. There was no dissolution clause. There was no review period. At the bottom, in smaller writing than the rest, he had written, "This is not a gesture. It is a legal document. The distinction matters to me, and I believe it matters to you." She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at it. She said, without looking up, "This is not how settlement documents are formatted." She said, from where he was standing, which was not far, "No." She said, "Hartley will need to redraft it properly." He said, "Yes." She said, "The beneficial interest clause in the 3rd paragraph would not hold in a chancery challenge." He said, "I will have Hartley fix it." She said, "The principle is correct." He said, "I know." She said, "The allowance figure is too high." "It is not." She said, "Hugh." It was the first time she had used his name. The room went still in the particular way that rooms go still when something irrevocable has been said, and she felt it, the irreversibility of it, and she did not pull back from the edge. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." She looked up. He was standing 3 paces away. She measured it, without meaning to, the way she measured everything, and his face had the expression she had named, and she let herself see it, and it was not comfortable, and it was not administratable, and it was not anything that could be put in a ledger, and she was glad of that. She was more glad of it than she had expected to be. She said, "I will sign it." She picked up the pen. He said, "You do not have to sign it tonight." She said, "I know." She signed it. She set the pen down. She looked at the writing case on the edge of the desk, the initials worn into the corner. The case she had carried on to a carriage in November, with her hands already moving toward the next problem, the next calculation, the next useful thing she could become. She said, "I thought if I kept being useful, you would not have grounds to remove me." He was quiet. She said, "I think I knew that was not the right reason, but I did not have a different one yet." He said, "What is the different one?" She said, "I have not written it down yet." He said, after a moment, "You do not have to write it down." She looked at him. He looked back. He said, in the compressed, graceless, entirely genuine voice of a man who has arrived at a statement he has been working toward for 4 months, "I do not want you to be useful. I want you to be here." It was not a poem. It was not a declaration. It was an administrative distinction drawn by a man who had spent 6 years keeping things at ledger entry distance and had finally run out of ledger pages. She said, "That will require a different kind of contract." He said, "I am aware." She said, "I will need to think about the terms." He said, "Take as long as you need." She said, "Hugh." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am already thinking about the terms." He said nothing. He sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair where Beale had sat, where Hartley had sat, which was the other chair in the room, and had always been there, and he looked at her, and she looked back, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them administered anything for the rest of the evening. In the morning, Nan came in to lay the accounts room fire and found 2 cups on the desk, both used. The lamp had burned down to its base. The settlement document was signed, and the writing case was closed, and outside the window the May rain had stopped sometime in the night, and the north fields were wet and pale green and entirely unbroken. This is not the story where she waited for him to see her. This is the story where she was already done with waiting, and he had exactly enough sense left to notice before the carriage cleared the gates. Eleanor Vane did not win this story by being saved. She won it the way she won everything, by reading the room, reading the document, and writing down what mattered before anyone else thought to look. And Levenwood did not fall in love the way men fall in love in stories. He fell in love the way he did everything. Slowly, through observation, and only after the evidence had become impossible to ignore. If you stayed for all of it, the cold marriage, the missing rents, the 12 notes in the writing case, the chair that was taken, and the man who stood beside the space it left, then you know good storytelling when you hear it, and so do your friends. Share this with someone who loves a woman who outsmarts the room. Like the video, if Eleanor's signature was the most romantic moment in the whole script. Subscribe and hit the bell so the next story finds you before someone spoils it. And before you go, one question, and I want to see you fight about it in the comments. Was Eleanor right to use the promissory notes as leverage, or did she win the legal argument and nearly lose the marriage in the same move? And is Levenwood's settlement document more romantic than a spoken declaration, or is a contract always just a contract, no matter whose name comes first? See you in the next one.